Hello and welcome, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. Welcome to this fireside chat, where through the next 30 minutes, Aliya and I will be walking through questions that lie at the intersection of large language model and content moderation systems, and tie those to questions of representation and speech and all of that. My name is Torsha. I work at the Center for Communication Governance, which is a research center located in the National Law University, Delhi, in India. And for this session, I'm joined by Aliya Bhatia, who's a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'll give her the floor to introduce herself in a moment. I just also wanted to note, by way of housekeeping, that we are keeping around 10 minutes at the end of the session for question answer. So if you have any sort of interventions or kind of queries you want to have answered, please drop them in the chat. And I'll maybe just start us off with a little bit of scoping, and I'll just throw it to Aliya for her. And just note that I know there is like a lot of kind of interconnected questions when you think about like LLMs and content moderation. I think our primary focus for this sort of next 30 minutes is on the integration of LLM technologies into content moderation capacities of social media platforms, as opposed to the more sort of one-to-one moderation that happens when you have an interaction with ChatGPT or Gemini and such. And this sort of integration of LLM technologies, that does happen, as OpenAI had sort of noted way back in 2023. This sort of integration apparently is to the benefit of a more accurate level of content moderation, the traditional content moderation that happens. It apparently helps with a faster upkeep with like content moderation policy changes, and as well as sort of reduce the burden of human moderators who would be otherwise engaged in this process. And undoubtedly, these are critical objectives, right? 15 years of content moderation literature shows us that these are things that scholars and practitioners are still grappling with. But then the question becomes, then is this a sort of paradigm shift where we're looking at content moderation as a system, as a solution to the problems of accuracy, as opposed to like questioning the sort of power these platforms hold or power these companies hold to even enact out these processes in the first place, and sort of like shield these platforms from questions of democratic legitimacy in a way. And tied to this, and as we sort of focus on these sessions, are then questions of representation and multi-stakeholderism, right? So if you think of LLM technologies, we know that in most contexts, these are developed in a deeply Anglo-centric context that developed in like global north and primarily in like US and European context, but then deployed in a very diverse region of the APAC. And then when that happens, how does that impact and modify the way people communicate over online spaces? How that maybe like raise barriers the way people communicate over online spaces? So this is sort of the task of this session, to touch upon these kind of various interconnected issues that come up in the development of technologies. And specifically, and you hear this term a lot, in the moderation of low resource languages. This is a topic that Aliya has worked substantively with. So having said that, I think I'll pause here now to sort of let Aliya make her introduction, and then we can jump into the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Torsha. As you mentioned, my name is Aliya Bhatia. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a 30-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, working on issues related to technology governance, and also development of technology in ways that are rights respecting. Yeah, I'm excited to touch on some of the questions you raised in the introduction about how does, broadly, what is the sort of pipeline for policy and process development for content moderation? What are the assumptions there that are made in developing those policies and processes about contexts that are different from Silicon Valley or the West, global North broadly? And some of my findings will also pull on case studies we've conducted, 4 case studies we've written about content moderation in non-English languages and low resource languages, specifically including a Tamil case study. But as you mentioned, content moderation has plagued social media companies for a long time. I think it's important to situate the use of large language models in a broader arsenal of automated tools companies have long used, either to comply with regulation or, as you said, to reduce human exposure to potentially traumatic and psychologically harmful content. But also because just the sheer scale these social media companies are operating in makes sort of the hiring and management of human moderators sort of untenable, impossible. It would require sort of people to be tasked with this job 12 hours a day, every day for years. Purely because these platforms are hosting billions, millions and billions of pieces of content. At the same time, these automated tools, while potentially increasingly necessary, also raise fundamental concerns as the ones you raised. So happy to dive into that.
Yeah, and I think that sort of forms the perfect segue to the first question, because we have talked a little bit about like the problems of like moderation at large, of like scale, and like of people just expressing their opinions at like a billion times per hour. So then the first question becomes then what is it that this integration of LLM technologies is trying to solve, right, in low resource languages? And then what even makes sort of moderating in these kind of non-English languages so difficult? And I think it might be good to also talk about what you consider low resource languages to be, to sort of set us up. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll first take a step back and say, how did we get here? We got here from companies developing automated tools, such as keyword filters, and then even more sort of sophisticated at the time machine learning classifiers, to moderate content at scale. They were saying, okay, we have these terms of service, we need to automate enforcement of these terms of service. And to do that, let's develop tools to detect a certain word. And when we detect that word, we can share those pieces of content or prioritize those pieces of content to be reviewed by a human person. And what happened was that when developing those tools, content moderators and teams developed a list of words that those platforms didn't want to host or could potentially be in sentences that were violative. Sorry. But in doing so, what happened is that these companies, largely operating in Silicon Valley and the West, didn't make the requisite investment in, I think there's an audio playing. Yeah. Didn't make the requisite investment of developing the same data sets for what those words that they wanted to not host in English would look like in the languages that the majority of their users in the global south were speaking. As we know, these platforms have been operating and are sort of essential infrastructure in places like South Asia, but also in Africa, in Latin America. And so these languages, the investment for these automated tools were more done in English than in any other languages. And we saw what the consequences of that were. There has been sort of online speech linked to offline violence in places like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, in Ethiopia, etc. Now, the promise and conceit of large language models is, oh, in the back in the day, we didn't have those data sets for these languages, but large language models are trained on so much text from around the internet that they are very, very successful in all languages, including low resource languages. Now, what are these low resource languages? AI researchers refer to this challenge that plagued computer scientists in developing these automated tools as the resourcefulness gap. Actually, one of the people who's coined this term is Pratik Joshi, formerly at Carnegie Mellon. And what he talks about is a gap or the delta between data sets available for high resource languages, so English and some UN languages like Spanish, French, Chinese, and languages mostly spoken in the global south, that have either no or very few high quality representative data sets in those languages. Almost all South Asian languages are considered either low to medium resourced. And this is, Nepali is considered a very low resource language. Assamese has only a couple of data sets sourced from government transcripts, and a couple of plays. Dravidian languages are particularly low resourced as well, just because of how investment is made. And what happens is, without adequate resourcing, without adequate available data sets to train these systems end up performing better in the languages they've seen a lot of text in, as opposed to the ones they haven't seen a lot of text in. Those contexts and languages, those contexts in which these languages are spoken, are where these systems are more error prone. So essentially, computer scientists are saying that large language models can bridge that resourcefulness gap because they're trained in such high quality and quantity of text from around the internet. And so they developed this very, robust understanding of human language that can overcome any language gap, because the belief or the assumption there is that all languages work in the same way. I think viewers of this can immediately sort of point out the fallacy in that assumption, given just the sheer difference in how languages work. And so, that's sort of where large language models play out. Our research has shown, my colleague Gabriel Nicholas and I put out a paper in 2023, found out that despite this promise of large language models working in languages where data sets are not very available, or the assumption that large language models can work in low resource languages, despite that assertion, these systems are still trained on 60% of the data they're trained on is in English. So, and worse, the evaluation data sets these systems are trained on are also in English or are machine translated. So that sort of pokes a hole in the claim that large language models, number one, perform in these languages, and number two, can be tasked with the very context specific and nuanced task of content moderation that does require sort of the judiciousness of human and subject matter and cultural understanding.
Yeah, thanks. And I think then that also ties to sort of the next question that we have around like perceptions of content moderation, because even before LLMs, I think there has been a lot of like user perception, and rightly so, about like the kind of opacity that exists around content moderation, the sort of like unilateral decision making that platforms take about like millions and billions of speech. So how does that sort of interplay with, now that we have this new technology with all its promises and all its flaws, how does that kind of interplay when you throw this into the mix of that existing culture of suspicion, I'd say? So
Yeah,
yeah,
no, I like the phrase culture of suspicion. And I
yeah,
and I think some of it comes from, distrust. Like, we've seen content moderation be wielded either in Anglo-centric or biased ways. We've seen a lot of different pressure points that have influenced content moderation, often at the expense of free expression rights or users' free expression rights specifically. I think it's important to sort of just level set in the beginning that content moderation is going to be an intractable problem, and content governance is sort of a loser's game, in that it's so nuanced, it's so in the eye of the beholder, and that there's always going to be dispute due to the lack of consensus around what is hate speech or what is an incitement of violence. Is it in the eye of the recipient of the threat? Is it according to a set of actors or a set of principles? I think that areas of gray have made fixing content moderation point blank very difficult. But at the same time, I think it's important to sort of say all that to say that large language models are sort of a technology shaped band-aid in a fundamentally human problem. And that there's two sort of corresponding problems. There's the one problem of the current paradigm of large language models, especially used in low resource languages, is fraught, right? These systems are not trained on not only high quality data in the languages we speak, in the context we speak them, but also high quality representative data. What do slurs look like in these low resource languages? What does slang look like in these languages? a lot of the data that large language models are trained on are incorrectly labeled or are machine translated from English into the regional language. And again, that sort of results in a very Anglo-centric perspective of how language works. A belief that every language like English is gendered, is subject, verb, object, is, that the slurs or the vectors of attack are the same as in the West. Um, but then there's also this like sort of dueling issue of even if we were to make the systems work 100% like perfectly in the languages we speak, content moderation is still so nuanced, right? What is the difference between um, someone actually glorifying terrorist violence versus condemning terrorist violence versus documenting in a journal or a newspaper or as a human rights advocate the glorification of human violence? A machine is not going to be able to parse the differences between those if they are tasked with fundamentally keyword detection, right? And we saw this in a meta oversight board case where in a case study, this is pre-large language models, but in a case study evaluating how the word shaheed, meaning martyr in Arabic and lots of other languages, Urdu, etc., is moderated, what they found was that any use of the word shaheed was found mostly by automated processes, but also some human, to be violative of the platform's dangerous organizations and individuals policy, even though the word shahid can be used in so many sort of quote unquote benign contexts. It can be used as a newspaper headline when a political leader or big figure dies. It can be used as a way to mourn a someone who dies. Especially, it can be used to condemn, politicized violence. There's just so many, and it's also used in like storefronts, like, and we found this in the Tamil case study as well. One of the keywords that flagged automated systems was the last name Prabhakaran, because it's the same last name of a former leader of a um, previously deemed terrorist organization, the LTTE in Sri Lanka. And so even people with their last names as Prabhakaran or storefronts with that name were being taken down. And so ultimately, what you have is systems that are being deployed into processes that are incredibly nuanced, rich, but in a non-nuanced way. And then obviously, there's this added layer of not only the suspicion and distrust, but actual adequate, or reduced investment in staffing, either reporting channels or in regional policy teams in South Asia and beyond that can do the sort of, uh, you know, expertise provision, right? They can provide the expertise of this is how the policy should work, this is how the system should be used. So without that, these systems are sometimes built to fail.
Nice. And I think I'd also then really be interested in hearing like some of your insights from the Tamil board, because it's like when I read some of that, it was quite surprising because Tamil is, in my understanding, quite a widely spoken language. There is, I think, like a wide diaspora, not just in India, but elsewhere as well that speak Tamil. And yet for their communicative like options online, like the resources simply does not exist. So if you could take us through some of those insights, I think that would be really, and with any other languages that CDT has also worked with. But yeah.
Yeah, so we wrote a case study on Tamil that came out in May 2025 this year. And then that accompanied three other case studies in Arabic, Maghrebi Arabic, Kiswahili, and Quechua, which are all also low resource languages. And as you know, Tamil is spoken by over 80 million people around the world. It's the official language or one of the official languages of multiple countries, including India, Sri Lanka, Singapore. It has a rich diaspora around the world, and also uniquely, Tamil has so much representation in the computing field, which makes its disinvestment very interesting and very politicized almost because of the corresponding political history of the Tamil language. in both in Sri Lanka. I mean, it has been a big part of previous civil wars and conflicts. In India, it's, it sort of is very much a part of the sort of language policy in North versus South debate. Um, and yet we see this disinvestment that results in Tamil being a low resource language. We found a lot of interesting things. One, we found that one complexity to documenting Tamil and making moderation better is just the range of ways people speak Tamil online. They speak Tamil using obviously Tamil characters. They use and the script. They use it. They speak it online using the Latin script and Romanized letters a lot due to the inaccessibility of keyboards, Tamil keyboards. Um, and so this transliteration then results in a sort of new form of Tamil entirely that has its own sort of unique rules. It's also a diglossic language, which means there are multiple forms. The distinct forms of the language, spoken versus written, is very different. And so, what it means to actually digitize this language for large language models to learn it and detect it is challenging because annotation, collection of that data, annotation is more complicated. Um, and then also because of just the proximity of Tamil speakers with other language speakers, so either Sinhala or Malayalam and other Kannada, etc., there's just so much code mixing that happens on the internet. There's a great academic, Monojit Chaudhary, who used to be at Microsoft Research India and now is at university in the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence in Saudi Arabia, who says that when people speak online, they usually speak in a dominant language and then use either code mix or speak in their mother tongue on social media when talking about cricket and politics, and do so in more slang and with more swear words. And so what that means is that the trove of data that is available on the internet to train on Tamil or a lot of other South Asian languages is this like sort of informal, poorly labeled, code mixed text that then again makes training a system to detect language a little more difficult. Um, Another thing we found was that Tamil speakers faced chronic inconsistent moderation. So potentially because of this, as I said, the complexity of how Tamil operates, both in written and spoken contexts, and the dearth of that training data or to train these systems, but also for other reasons, either political or underinvestment by companies. Tamil speakers pointed to a lot of under moderation, so facing feeds of hate speech and harassment that was like very obviously should be removed, especially when it was caste-based harassment, gender-based violent speech, and keywords that were repeatedly told to platforms are violative, stayed on the platform, even though users reported it, even though users would flag it to noted to sort of contacts within companies. At the same time, they faced what they believed to be over moderation, especially when they spoke about politics and political issues. So that I think is a huge, also alarming trend of the sort of what are the pressure points to make moderation better in low resource languages and who has that power, right? One way where governments are intervening in low resource language content moderation is number one, by providing data sets to companies and to AI developers. Because, there's a reasonable need and want for systems to work in these languages. But what happens when the government mediates what is language? How do people speak online? And so that raises fundamental free expression questions of, you know, how does one represent language? How does one represent access to information that large language models are going to be the conduit of? And then also, number two, we found in the case study, governments were putting pressure on companies to use these data sets and others to train systems to sort of ramp up moderation in these languages when they either saw fit, when they saw as compliant with their policies, or when they sort of threatened banning of a platform. So again, what are the incentives? It seems like the incentives are less for users' free expression and ability to navigate these sites free from free from harassment and in safe ways, and more for like sort of social media government relationship management.
Yeah, that's really interesting because in a lot of my previous writing and thinking also, content moderation and like platform governance ideally is sort of a contestation between the citizen, the state, and the private party. And yet it seems that in almost every sort of interaction, it's the citizens and the users that sort of lose out because like absence of bargaining power or just the seemingly that state and private parties are just simply too vast for us to negotiate with. I am conscious we only have about 3 minutes in time. I will remind audience that you can still like drop your questions in the chat. And maybe I don't think we have time for another question for you, Aliya, but if you have any sort of closing remarks, any thoughts as we bring this discussion to close, I think that would be good with about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, please do submit questions. I think, two things I'll say is that we need to think about alternatives to content moderation, whether it's sort of equipping users with the tools to, as you say, exercise the power that they should have in the sort of pyramid-shaped nexus. And so they have power online. And then also how, one question I have is like, how do we develop more user tools, not just levers for them to exercise their power, but tools for them to control what they see in their online environment and apply pressure on platforms to make those tools available, whether it's user-controlled, user-level filtering of certain keywords. And a number of groups are actually working on that. So creating a policy, legal paradigm where those tools are sort of foster and become more available, that I think is a really good big opportunity in the content moderation debate. And one of these tools is the Uli plugin that organization called Tattle has been building in India that enables users to filter out gender-based harassment and caste-based harassment in multiple languages, including Hindi, Tamil, and Indian English. And I know they're working on others as well. And I think that there's room for those tools to proliferate now that a lot of third-party trust and safety arenas are opening up, like Roost or the Trust and Safety Foundation, etc.
Yeah, that's going to be like, I think, sort of the final thread to pull in, given like the theme of APRIGF is also multi-stakeholderism. Like, how do we imagine a sort of more multi-stakeholder-ish deployment of these technologies that's not just like a contestation between governments and private parties? And yeah.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'm thinking a lot about is that there's no dearth of experts working in this field across the stakeholder groups, right? There's academic researchers. The Tamil case study was fun because we spoke with so many Tamil computing experts who built the data sets, built the tools, even the Tamil specific fact-checking tool, like Vani NLP, for example. It's just that they lack pipelines to make those tools available for the like by the to give them to the companies, or the companies obviously lack the incentives or the will to use them. So what are ways that we can sort of force multi-stakeholder participation engagement almost, which seems sort of antithetical to the nature of multi-stakeholder spaces, but how do we create that community of practice, I think. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for this conversation, and please stay in touch.
Thanks, everyone. I think our time is up. So thanks, Aliya, for joining us at like 12 in the night from where you're based out of. So, and staying up to talk about moderation and tuning in. And thanks to the organizers for giving us this platform. We continue to think about and write about these issues. So please do look out for that. So yeah, over to the organizers then.